Apollo 13 launched on April 11th, 1970. Its mission was to make a trip to the moon, to land there and perform all the different experiences. This was the third Apollo mission that was to land on the moon. But 56 hours into that flight, everything changed. An oxygen tank on the vessel exploded, severely damaging the spaceship. Then those words were uttered that I'm pretty confident that most of you have heard before. Houston, we have a problem. As they communicated back with the command central there in Houston, Texas, that was the words. The truth is, actually, that's been altered a little bit over time. The actual words were, okay, Houston, we've had a problem. But either way, the situation was the same. They were 200,000 miles from home with a damaged vessel, not sure what to do next. You know, we're in our third week of our series that we're calling Foundations, where we're looking at some very core passages of Scripture from Genesis and seeing how they build a foundation for our lives. This is all part of our Core 52 series that we're going through the whole year. You know, we've dealt with some core issues like creation, and that's huge to how we view life, because we either believe that we're here by accident or the world was created by God with a divine plan and strategy for all of that. We looked at who we are, not just how we got here, but who we are, that we're created in the image of God. And once again, that's huge to how we view life. Whether you see yourself as an accident or an evolving or divinely placed here by God. It's huge in how we go about that, how we go about life. Now that creation has taken place, the creation is finished, God has put His seal of approval on all that He wanted to create, we come to the next place where we deal with a core issue or core principle in our lives. This is where we're going to look today is in Genesis chapter 3. And if you want to turn there, that's where we're going to spend just about all of our time. But Genesis chapter 3, starting with verse 1, says this. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say, 'You must not eat from any tree in the garden'?" The woman said to the serpent, "We may eat fruit." The serpent, "We may eat fruit from the trees in the garden." But God did say, "You must not eat fruit from the tree that is in the middle of the garden, and you must not touch it, or you will die." If you can just get this thought in your mind, that at this point, everything is in a state of perfection. There's nothing wrong in the world. Everything is perfect. But we know it's not going to stay that way long. Just those words, "now the serpent." It gives you that sense of an ominous sound to it, that uh-oh, buckle up. Something is about to happen, and it's not going to be good. The serpent raises a lot of questions, doesn't it? There's several things to note. The serpent created by God. This was one of this was part of the creation. But it still doesn't answer who the serpent is here. We in our Christian circles, we here at Macedonia, we believe in the creation of the world by a divine God. And we believe that the serpent is the devil. There's Satan. And it's interesting that in other places in the Bible, even though it doesn't call him Satan right here, other places in the Bible, God identifies the serpent as the devil. For instance, over in Revelation chapter 12, when he's talking about the end times and going through the history, he says this, "The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He was hurled to the earth and his angels with him." So we know who the serpent is. It's the devil. It's Satan. Any of those ones that you want to call. He not only led Eve astray, it says he leads the whole world astray. Now look at verses 4 and 5. "You will not surely die," the serpent said to the woman, For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. When the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food, and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. She also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made coverings for themselves. How many times have you noticed that we begin a sentence, a conversation with someone, with the phrase, hey, we got a problem. Hey, we got something we got to deal with. We say things like, what's your problem? We say things like, well, the problem is. How much of our life revolves around that? It was just this week I was driving and there was someone tailgating me. And I mean, they were right on me. And as I was looking at him, I could see it was an older gentleman, and he was driving. He was right up on the wheel and had his little blue disposable face mask. He was wearing it as he was driving and had it down below his nose and driving. And he said, Greg, you notice a lot of details. He was that close to me. I could see it that clearly. You know, I was thinking, man, he's driving like it's the Daytona 500, and I'm expecting him any minute to just pull out and slingshot past me to win the race. And you know what thought came to my mind immediately? Hey, what's this guy's problem? We think about those things. What's your problem? But as we're going to see, this is everybody's problem. It wasn't just Eve's problem. It's not just your problem. It's my problem. It's everybody's problem. It started with Eve in the garden. But sin has found its way into every person's life. And if it hadn't have been Eve, it would have been someone else. So we can't blame her for too much. We have a problem. The problem is sin. Nothing will ever be the same. It's never going to be the same. In a perfect creation, once sin entered in, it never was the same. Verse 7 already says that they lost their innocence. It says that they noticed that they were naked. That just points out to how innocent they were in the world they were living in. And soon as you continue to read on in Genesis chapter 3, you'll see that because of sin, a wedge is put between them and God. They soon lie to God. They hide from God. Animals had to die to make clothes, coverings for them. Everything's changing. Work is still work, but now it's more burdensome to work. They lost their place to live. They had to go and find a new place to live. You know, even the birth process, as part of the curse as you read through there, even the birth process, it says, will become painful. Ladies, I know you can give me a big amen on that one. But every time a child is born, we're reminded of not just how wonderful life is, but we're reminded of how sin entered the world and it changed everything. Houston, we have a problem. If this is a foundational event in our being here, where we find ourselves living today, then it deserves to be studied, to be looked at, to be considered. Why? Because it's how we got in the mess we're in. Not just in our own personal lives, but as we look around at our countries, as we look at the nations, as we look at this world, we look at history, we look at the prospects for the future of how people live. This is a problem. And we need to know what we can. Some of you right now are suffering because of the sins of your parents. What they did in raising you, what they exposed you to. You've had to deal with those things. Some of us are dealing with the sins of our past and decisions that we made, and we're still paying for those now. The decisions, good and bad, that you make today will affect your life tomorrow and down the road. It will affect and be reflected in the relationships that you have. So it's worth looking back at this. So go back to the garden situation. It says that the crafty serpent and an innocent Eve. This is a dangerous situation, a combination. Craftiness versus innocence. Now, I don't know if God did this on purpose, but the Hebrew word for cunning or crafty that he used to describe the serpent sounds like the Hebrew word for naked. Was God doing a play on words about the cunning and craftiness versus the innocence of mankind at that point? I don't know, but it is interesting. And I do know this. We cannot afford to be naive, to not realize that there is someone who's trying to bring us down. His name is Satan. You know, sin changes everything. Sin by definition is missing the mark, disobedience, moral failure. We can't pretend that it doesn't exist. We can't pretend that it hasn't changed everything. If I can go back to the Apollo 13 story, it's so interesting to read about what took place. It was an oxygen tank that exploded on the outside of the ship, but it affected everything, and everything that they began to do to plan to be able to survive and make it back to Earth 200,000 miles away. That when they would make one move, it complicated a situation in another. Would they have enough power? If they turned everything off to conserve energy, would they be able to restart everything? It's just interesting, all of the problems that built upon each other because of this one event. You know, sin does not operate in a vacuum. Sin has consequences. Sin has complications, and it causes us to alter the way we live, and it's altered our lives. You see, this wasn't about a woman eating a piece of fruit that she was told not to. This is about rebellion against God, a choosing to go your own way, away from God. And it does have consequences. It has complications. Sin changes everything. Sin changes my mind. It changes how I think. When I was I guess you would say it was in middle school, I had a friend who was a little older and could drive, and in our youth group, and he worked at a movie theater. And my mom would take and drop me off at the movie theater, and he would always just let me in free. So for a long period there, I saw movie after movie after movie and never had to pay anything. And this came to me this week. I was thinking about, I saw one movie called Dillinger. It was about that early criminal in the United States called John Dillinger. And he was a terrible criminal. But you know what? As you go through the movie, you found yourself kind of pulling for him. When he got killed, you were sad that it happened. The movie Bonnie and Clyde came out. I'm really old school here. Bonnie and Clyde, talking about this man and woman who were terrorizing part of the United States by robbing banks and all the things. You know what? You begin to kind of side with them. And when they get killed, you're sad that happened to them. And I remember many years later when I watched The Godfather. And I'm good or bad, I'm a big fan of the movies The Godfather. And it's like, here they are, they're criminals, they're criminal bosses. And you kind of end up being on their side. You want to see things work out for them. Why is that? How can you pull for the bad guy? Well, see, sin changes the way we think. It changes the way we look at things in life. Look at what Paul said over in 2 Corinthians 11:3. He says, "But I am afraid that just as Eve was deceived by the serpent's cunning, your minds may somehow be led astray from your sincere and pure devotion to Christ." You see what he's warning these Christians at Corinth? He says, I'm afraid you're going to be led astray. That you're going to be deceived just like Eve was. Maybe that's why he talked later on in Romans, that when he said to them, he said, do not conform any longer to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, don't think like the world. You've got to rethink and think like God thinks about the world. Sin changes the way we think. It changes our mind. But sin changes our strategy as well. The devil had a strategy. He operated in the gray areas of life. He moved about and dealt with Eve in a way that he just worked not in the black and white of life, but the gray areas. Everything he said to Eve had an element, a piece of truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. He dealt in deception that way. Everything he did was dealing in the gray areas of life. We have to recognize his strategy, this strategy, and then come up with one ourselves, because he is going to target our weaknesses. Trust me, he has a strategy for what he does. Eve was in trouble when she said this, or when she thought this, in Genesis 3:6. And this is our memory verse this week. It says, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some and ate it. We cannot afford to be naive in how we view sin. We cannot be so innocent that we don't recognize that the devil has a strategy to use against us. And we must come up with a strategy of our own. The combination of a calculated attack and our weaknesses are devastating. And they will be devastating to our lives. Eve looked at notice how it says she viewed the fruit. She saw it as essential. She saw it as pleasurable. And she saw that choosing it was a smart decision. Now, is that not just the same process that we go through when we choose things and make decisions today that end up being against or not following God? It's the same way today. We're naive about that. And we had something happen here at the church. Went out to start the church van, had to run an errand to town. I said, I'll just drive the van. And when I cranked it up, it sounded like I was cranking up a race car for the start of a NASCAR race. I mean, it was unbelievably loud. So I turned it off and I said, what in the world? Cranked it back up, still just loud as it could be. And Eric came out and he was looking like, what's going on? And we looked under the van and the catalytic converters were gone. I don't mean that they were worn out. I mean they were gone. Somebody had stolen the catalytic converters off of the exhaust system. So Dustin pulled up the security footage, cameras, and we found it one night. Guy pulls in, parks beside the church van, crawls under the van with a saw, cuts the converters off, puts them in his car, and drives off. You know, and everybody I've told that story to and says, I can't believe somebody would do that to the church. You know, and I can't believe it either, but, you know, that just shows we're a little naive. We can't afford to be that way anymore. Doing it to a church or to anyone else, that's just fine with the devil. And we must realize that we have to be on our guard, that we have to have a strategy to realize that we're under attack. But I want to tell you, it's not all bad news as we're reading this. This brings me to this last point I want to mention. Sin revealed God's best. Sin revealed the best of God. God had created a perfect world. But with sin, it appears that it is ruined. Let me ask you this question. Was Apollo 13 a successful mission? I mean, they didn't get to land on the moon. They didn't get to do any of the things that they got to do. But by their work with the scientists and technicians on the ground and what they did there on Apollo 13 to getting it back to the earth and saving those 3 lives is considered NASA's greatest moment, its finest hour. So was it a success? Yes, it was a success. As we watched that, and I can remember as the news came out about Apollo 13 has had a problem, and for the next 4 days, we stayed tuned to see if those men were going to make it home safe. And we were spellbound by this. It was a success. But the sin in the garden, as it looks like a failure, also revealed and set into motion the plan of God to bring man and God back together. If you think creation was the greatest thing God has ever done, then you need to wait and see what he's getting ready to do to bring man and God and his creation back together again. At first glance, it appears Satan has won. He's got what he wanted. We lost. God's perfect plan is destroyed. But God addresses the serpent, the devil, in a few verses. And I just want to read one of those verses. It's contained in that part that we consider the curse, all of the consequences and complications of a sinful person, of a sinful mankind being in the world. Genesis 3:15, God is saying this to the serpent. He says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers." Now listen to this. "He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Most Bible scholars believe that this is the first and credit it as the first prophecy of the birth of Jesus. And it's saying, hey, Satan, you seem to have gotten your way right now. But born through Eve and all the way down the line, there's going to be someone who is born who you will hurt, but he'll crush you. He's talking about Jesus. Jump ahead a couple of thousand years to another occasion where Satan has initiated the trouble, where he's trying to destroy God's perfect plan. From the moment Jesus was born, Satan was trying to ruin the plan. He tried every way possible to have the baby Jesus killed. He complicated his life tremendously. And then when Jesus began his ministry and began to preach all around Jerusalem and Palestine, all of these places, he was raising up opposition. And finally it came to a head where they arrested Jesus, and people were whipped up into such a fashion that they were ready to crucify him and kill him. And it looks precisely just like the Garden of Eden, that God's perfect plan was going to be foiled. But don't you see that it was because of the devil adversary or going against God's perfect plan? It was through the crucifixion, the cross, the death, the burial, when it appears that everything is destroyed, that is exactly how God destroyed Satan. Jesus crushed Satan. He crushed death. He crushed the penalty for sin, all by doing this. God's greatest plan was revealed. And you can trace it all the way back to the foundation of the garden and our first sin, the fall of mankind. You know, as a minister, most of the time we get to this point in our message and we kind of try to bring everything to a close and bring everybody to a conclusion, a point, a decision that you have to make. But I don't think I have to do that today. If you've listened to any of what I've said, if you've read the verses that I've read, and you've meditated on them, you know that there's a point of decision for you. Wherever you're at in the walk of your life, maybe you're not calling the things in your life sin, and you're not paying attention to them, and you're just going along, you're being very naive. Maybe you're going along and have no strategy to keep yourself, as Paul said, pure and devoted to God. Maybe you've never dealt with the sin that's in your life and never accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior. Had those sins washed away. I don't know. Wherever you are, these speak to you in some way at some place. And I pray that you will deal with those things today, wherever you are. I can tell you one place that you can deal with it. As you sit down today to take the Lord's Supper, whether alone or with your family, you can remember this. The greatest accomplishment, the greatest creation of God is not, the greatest blessing you have is not, it's not life itself. It's not the bank account. It's not the house you're sitting in right now. It's not anything other than what Jesus Christ has done for us. What a tremendous plan. And as you take the Lord's Supper, it's to remember that great plan, that great love, that great execution of a plan that was for you and I. God bless you. We'll see you next week.